Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail. Today we are going to share Skinwalker horror stories. First story, Camping Alone, Skinwalker's story. As the last flames licked across the fire and faded, leaving a warm glow from the embers below, I drank the last warm swigs of tea from my canteen and thought about heading to sleep. The stack of firewood by my camp would remain unburned until the morning. My camp was a tarp tied up with paracord to the surrounding trees. It was basic but lightweight and easy to carry on hikes. I had built a wall from fallen deadwood held between wooden stakes around the camp to deter any predators. I fumbled for the zip on my sleeping bag in the low light and eventually found it and unzipped it. I took off my boots and prepared to get in, very tired from the day of walking and wood cutting to make my camp. As I climbed in and closed my eyes, I heard a sudden noise from the treetops. It sounded as though every bird in the woods was flying away. A great flapping of wings and the odd squawk of warning prompted me to open my eyes. The embers from the fire were dull now, meaning that I couldn't see any of my surroundings. I have spent a lot of time in the woods and know that it would take a large predator to spook roosting birds enough to fly away en masse. I lay still and tried to listen, but I could hear nothing but the fading flaps of the birds' wings. They weren't nesting again, they were leaving the area. I heard the last of these noises and then nothing. The woods were silent, eerily silent. I don't know if you have ever spent a night in the woods, but for the first few times it is quite scary due to the various unexplained noises. Nocturnal animals prowling about, owls and rodents all make up the nighttime ambience of the woods. Over time, though, these sounds become comforting. There was nothing, no noise whatsoever. I sat up still, unable to see anything. I quietly reached over for a log to place on the embers. They were still hot enough and the log dry enough that they would catch. As my hand found a log and I began to lift it, I heard a branch snap nearby. I had made my camp in a clearing so as not to fall victim to loose tree branches falling in the wind, but all around me was dense, unkept forest. The only path the route that I had cut out to reach the clearing. The noise came from the path. I sat frozen, log in my hand, straining to listen. There came another crack of a branch. This did not sound like sticks breaking, but a large crack like a branch being trodden on. This has to be a large animal to make such a noise. I strained to see in the darkness, but the embers, while low still, inhibited my night vision. It was then that the smell hit me, an overpowering stench of decay. I gagged a little, trying to remain silent, not wanting to attract any attention to my camp. I then heard a shuffling. Whatever this creature was, it was taking the path I had cut. I heard it brushing against the leaves, overhanging the trail, the rustling of the low-lying leaves of the trees. Whatever it was, the creature was big, at least 7 feet judging by the height of even the lowest trees. I noticed my breathing becoming heavier and tried to force myself to take controlled, quiet breaths. The smell of death in each breath was so thick I could taste it. That's when I saw the shadow, the unmistakable shape of a deer. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling silly to have been so frightened by such a common woodland creature that I have encountered so many times before. It stopped moving and the silence returned. So silent it was almost deafening. It was then I noticed that I could only make out 2 legs, hind legs, but the shadow continued upwards. This deer was stood on its hind legs, its back stretched straight, its front legs and paws hung at its side. This was no deer. My mind suddenly went into overdrive. I consulted a mental image I had made of the area before the light had died, and it was surrounded by dense woodland. Impossible to run through at night without seriously injuring myself. The only way out was the path that the creature was stood on, still unmoving. I had not been hunting on this occasion and had not bought a gun with me. I was only camping for 2 days and so had enough food and drink with me. I had a large knife, but this thought did not fill me with much hope. I decided that I would scare it away with fire. I dropped the log I was holding into the pit of embers, pushing into them a little past the cooler embers at the top. I quickly placed several more around it and then hurriedly felt around the pitch-black floor for sticks. I found a few twigs and threw them on. One of the sticks caught, and a tiny flame shot up from the fire. While small, it illuminated the clearing enough for me to see the creature standing in my end of the path. I could not make out details, but I could see its shape and its antlered head, which was sniffing the air in my direction. The other twigs caught, and I saw it. It had the body of a deer, but its flesh hung from its bones. It looked as though it had been decomposing for a while, and yet here it was trying to get my scent. Its torso was upright, its broken ribs exposed through the rotting flesh of its chest. The head was the most disturbing. Much of its skull was showing, but its antlers had remained intact. Its head hung to its left side as if its neck was broken. Its eyes, or the space where its eyes had once been reflected a bright red in the light of the fire. It looked as though there was something inside it wearing it like a costume. It opened its jaw and head hanging to one side. It let out a scream. The noise was nothing like a deer, nothing like I have heard from any animal I have ever seen. I felt it all the way through me. A long undulating noise, high-pitched and shrill. My skin felt like ice, and I remember screaming run in my head. All care for the dangerous terrain surrounding me gone from my mind. I couldn't move. I was frozen, sitting in my camp, staring at the monstrosity before me. It took a step toward me when two of the logs caught fire, flames leaping up. The creature stopped and swung its head around to look at the fire, then back at me. It was at this point I thought I had a chance. The fire seemed to have scared it. I was wrong. It launched itself at me with amazing speed, probably only 20 feet away now. I finally found my ability to move and jumped up and sprinted in the other direction. I reached the tree lean, and without looking back, I jumped into it, holding my arms up in front of my face to shield my eyes from the many sticks and plants. I didn't make it far. I ran into a large branch and fell over. I wanted to look behind me, but I could not bring myself to. Instead, I scrabbled underneath the branch and started running again the other side. I hit 3 more branches in the darkness, and the last one hit me in the chest and winded me. I lay on the ground, trying to catch my breath, thankful that I could no longer taste the awful taste of rotten deer flesh. I tried a breath quietly, trying to listen for sound around me. The woods were still quiet, but I could hear periodic crashes of a large creature, presumably searching for me in the darkness. The crashes were off in the wrong direction, though, and seemed to be getting further away, not closer. I lay in this spot for what felt like eternity, but was probably about 2 to 3 hours judging by the light. I finally heard a little forest critter scurrying through the undergrowth, then another, then an owl hoot. It was clear that the predator had left the area. I didn't go back to my stuff. I stood up and headed straight for the nearest edge of the woods. I picked up a large branch as a weapon and slowly picked my way through the woods. I reached the exit at what looked like around 4 a.m. The sun started to rise again, but not yet visible. I walked over to my car. It was just as I'd left it. I opened the door, and as I did, a smell of rotten flesh suddenly hit me. I slammed the door, started the engine, and drove out of there. My wheels span on the forest floor as I revved the car too hard. I didn't care. I just wanted to be away. I glanced in my rear-view mirror, just as I was leaving the parking area, and saw it running across the middle of the car park behind me. Its running looked awkward, yet it was still so fast. I put my foot to the floor and didn't look back again. I don't go camping without my gun anymore, hunting or not. The creature has been following me since we first met deep in the woods, a memory that still haunts my dreams. Sometimes waking up in terror sweating, I could swear I can smell its putrid odor. I have been told that the creature is a skinwalker, a creature of Native American lore often thought of as a witch. They are known to disguise themselves as an animal in order to get close to the people that they wish to harm. In my case, the abomination manifested itself as a deer, although its disguise was poor. A rotten deer carcass walking on its hind legs, its neck broken and hanging to one side. In the 2 years since then, I have had 4 encounters with this creature, but this story is about this night. Each encounter has been when I am alone. The sight and smell of the creature has filled me with terror like I have never felt before. I live alone in a cottage near a woodland. The trees border my property, and there is a small wire fence separating me from the woods. I glance at the clock, 2:34 a.m. It is around this time I feel the most alone and vulnerable. About this time it usually shows up. I open the window to see if I could see through the rain. The sound of the downpour filled my living room. Outside it seemed quiet, the noise of the rain hitting the trees the only sound. It was then I saw the shadow. It stood still in the tree line, the only object not swaying in the wind. My stomach dropped, my heart beating faster. The familiar terror was creeping back into me. I slowly and quietly closed the window and locked it. I then circled my house, checking that all of the doors and windows were locked up tight. I loaded my pistol and took off the safety. I have read that guns cannot hurt a skinwalker, and I have never been able to get a shot off at it before, but it made me feel somewhat safer anyway. I turned off the lights and looked back through the window. The shadow was gone. I looked around frantically for any signs of movement within the trees. It was then that a loud, slow, rhythmic banging on the back door started. The knocks were heavy, rattling the door on its hinges. I let out a small yelp, unable to keep it in. I ducked down below the windows and crawled on all fours to the back door. The banging seemed louder. Each knock jarred my mind a little further. I took aim at the door and pulled back the hammer. A pain spread through my chest, and I realized that I had been holding my breath. I took in a large breath and choked on the putrid smell of rotten deer flesh. An all too familiar smell now. I gagged, and as I did, so the banging stopped. The cottage seemed deathly quiet. The rain had stopped abruptly, further emphasizing the silence. There was a loud noise outside the kitchen window. I turned to look and carefully stood up and peeked out of the window. A couple of smashed roof tiles lay on the ground. It was on the roof. The fear was too much. I expected it to get easier each time, but in actuality, each encounter the terror got worse and worse. I started sobbing quietly. I thought about this thing following me for the rest of my life. The thought was unbearable. I heard a window pane break upstairs. It was inside. I heard its heavy footsteps through the ceiling. It was searching through the rooms upstairs. It wouldn't be long now before it found me curled up on the kitchen floor, sobbing to myself. I looked at the loaded gun. The stairs creaked. It was heading downstairs. The handle of the door leading from the stairs turned. I raised my pistol. The door flew open, and there it stood, its smell enveloping me. It was wearing the same deer. For 2 years, the same animal in the same state of decay. Walking on its hind legs, its front legs hanging at its side, its head hanging to its left side. The sockets where its eyes were glowed red. The first time I believed it to be a reflection from my campfire, but every time its eyes had the same dull, red glow. I meant to fire 5 of my 6 shots at the creature, saving the last for myself, but in fright I squeezed the trigger once too many. 4 of the shots hit their target. The others were wide, hitting the wall and the door. The sound of the shots were deafening in the small room. The smell of cordite faint behind the smell of the creature. It didn't even flinch. The bullets hit their mark. I could see the flesh wounds, heard the dull sound of the bullets impacting flesh. It looked at me for a moment and let out its familiar scream, high-pitched and undulating at the same time. My blood felt like ice. I made a desperate sprint for the garage door. I flung it open and stepped into the dark garage, slamming the door behind me. I leaned with my back against the door as the creature struck it. The force was so great, I fell to the floor. I leapt back up and tuned the key in the lock. It began hammering the door with such force, I was sure that the door would break from its hinges. I looked around, my eyes darting from object to object. I saw a gas can and a blowtorch. I decided to burn it, try to end this once and for all. I pressed the button on my remote to open the garage door, flung open the car door, and inserted the key into the ignition and turned it. The car sprang to life. I reached for the gas can and fumbled with the screw top, my arms shaking and my fingers not obeying my commands. I poured a pool of gasoline by the door. I picked up the blowtorch and clicked the button. The blue flame seemed so bright in the darkness. I tossed it into the pool of petrol, and it ignited just as the door was forced from its hinges. I leapt into the car and, without even shutting the door, put it in drive and slammed my foot to the floor. In my mirror, I saw the creature stood in the doorway. The remaining fur on its rotten body was alight. It seemed not to be concerned about the flames leaping up its body. I hoped with all my heart that it would burn to death in my house. As I drove down the drive, I kept glancing in the mirror, watching as my house and all of my belongings went up in flames. I lost sight of the creature, but my whole being was praying that it was dead and I wouldn't have to live like this anymore. Later that morning, I stood on the steps of my house, the flames extinguished. I explained what had happened to the fire service, but they looked at me with disbelief. As a courtesy, they checked for animal prints around the house, but found no signs that the creature had been there at all. The insurance company would not pay out as it was concluded that I started the fire. I am now staying in a hotel far into the city and away from woodlands. I still do not know if it perished in that fire, although no body was found. I still cannot rest. I still check the windows. I'm not sure how much longer I can live like this, how long I can carry on living in fear. No one will believe my story, and I have been forced to attend counseling due to me burning down my own house. I'll try to write up my other encounters soon, but it takes a lot out of me to put this on paper. Although each time it is read, I do feel slightly better. Even if it is not believed, at least I don't just have to keep it to myself. Second story, my friend SKINWALKER's story. Back in college, a buddy and I were hanging out in our dorm room, smoking some weed and chilling. We get on the topic of creepypastas and stuff, and I mentioned that I've heard some really creepy SKINWALKER stories. My buddy gets really quiet out of nowhere. I saw one once, up close and personal. That shit is real, bro. Of course, I asked him to tell me more. He said he didn't like talking about it, but eventually he opened up. So his story took place back in the summer before he left for college. Him and his high school friend group had planned a big last hurrah camping trip. He was from Scottsdale, Arizona, and I think he said they only drove a good hour and a half outside the city to one of their friends' parents' ranching properties. There's about 8 people in their group, and everyone shows up around the same time in 3 separate cars. Around when they show up, it's already starting to get dark, so they set up their tents and a campfire and start drinking and smoking. This one dude in their group, let's call him Tim, is being a little more quiet than usual. My buddy asks him what's wrong, and he says something like, "I don't feel good, just a little under the weather today." Regardless, they start making brats and are all having a good time. Then out of nowhere, everyone notices Tim is gone, just totally vanished. Nobody even saw him leave, even though everyone was relatively close to the fire. The group starts calling his name, thinking he's pranking everyone. Then they start to get worried once Tim has been gone for over an hour. So my friend and a couple others go out into the hills to search for him. They walk around for a good 15 minutes, calling his name before they finally get a response. It's not Tim. Instead, they hear the familiar howl of a coyote, and it's answered by a couple other coyotes. My buddy says he was a little worried at this point that Tim might have gotten dragged off by the wild animals. Everyone in their group was paranoid because there's no way Tim could have gone missing without anyone noticing. Just no way. They hear another howl, suddenly. It's longer than the others, and different in that it sounds off, like if someone had a recording of a coyote howling and decided to play it. My friend's blood ran cold when the howl ended in a sort of hacking laughter. And unlike the howl, the laughter sounded close, like 20 feet away close. The group starts frantically looking around, convinced Tim is out there with them. He isn't. They don't see anyone. They return to the fire a little shaken up. Everyone is really starting to get worried at this point. The group starts considering calling the police when suddenly a truck pulls up to the campsite. It's Tim's truck. Tim steps out of it and is wondering why everyone has been freaking out. Tim says he's sorry. He got off work 2 hours late and hurried out to the ranch as fast as he could. This is when the group realizes that Tim didn't carpool there with anyone. As if on cue, they hear another long, drawn-out howl, just like the other one. At that point, the group noped out of there. They ended up paying to camp in a designated campground, and the night went on as normal. But my friend still says he thinks about when he asked him if he was all right. He claims that at the time, he could definitely tell something was off about Tim, but didn't think anything of it. But now he's 100% convinced that Tim was some sort of skinwalker entity impersonating his friend for shits and giggles. How the creature knew what Tim looked and sounded like. Well, he has no explanation for that. Maybe he just got inside their heads. Third story, my skinwalker experience. My day started off pretty normal. At 6:30, my alarm woke me up, and I proceeded with my normal routine, such as I showered, brushed my teeth, and threw my hiking gear on. I'm a pretty avid hiker, wouldn't say very experienced, but I know what I'm doing, so I go every weekend when I can. Around 7:30, that was when I was ready to drive to my chosen hiking route, Basalt Mountain, Colorado. This was about a 3-hour drive from where I live, so I was pretty exhausted by the time I got there after being up so early. The hike started off great. The sun was beaming down on me, and I could hear all the birds singing and all the critters running around in the forests. Along my route that I chose, there was gorgeous views and amazing scenery, so I stopped whenever I could have taken the views and just live in the moment. A few times I stopped to make myself a coffee and to take some stunning photos for my friends back home in the UK. However, by the time I got to the top, I realized it was getting dark. This is when I noticed I was walking back in the dark. This is where it started to get creepy. On my way back down, I had a sharp feeling on the back of my head, like someone was watching me. I chose to ignore it and carried on walking. The thing is, though, the more I walked and the darker it got, the feeling kept getting more intense. In an act to distract myself, I whistled the tune to my favorite song. This is when I could hear someone walk behind me in the distance, but not too far to not hear them. Too far to see them, though. I kept glancing behind me and kept seeing nothing, looked to my left and right, and still nothing. As I kept on walking, I could still hear it following me, and that sharp feeling of being watched was getting unbearable. About 40 minutes has passed since setting off back down, and I didn't notice whatever was following has been slowly getting closer. I realized this when I looked behind me, about the 100th time, and this time I saw a deer. This wasn't a normal deer either. This deer looked like if it was dead, but somehow still alive. It had red, glowing eyes locked right onto me, its skin all patchy, and some of it hanging off too. Bones were sticking out off its limbs and chest, blood also dripping from its mouth. It just wasn't natural. By the time it sunk into what I was looking at, it started walking to me at a fast pace. That ain't normal either, I thought. Then it hit me. I'm gonna die if I don't run. I flung my body around and started sprinting for my life with every ounce of energy I had. That's when I heard it. That shrill scream from behind. Sounded half human, half coyote. The human half sounded like a death scream. It sent chills down my spine and my shit into my pants. Footsteps were getting faster and closer behind me, but I kept on pushing. My legs were burning and my lungs screaming. I wanted to quit. That's when it was close enough, I could hear it grunting. I was shitting myself. After running for what felt like an eternity later, I built up the courage to look over my shoulder. This was a mistake. What I saw was no longer a deer. While I was looking, it was roughly 7 foot tall. It had abnormally long limbs, and it was insanely skinny with barely any muscle on its frame. What skin it had was gray and hanging from its limbs and torso, just like the deer. Some of it was human skin, some of it was animal skin. From what I could make out, the animal skin could have been from a deer or even a coyote. What creeped me out the most was its face. Well, lack of. 2 hollow and black pits replaced the eyes, and it had a gaping mouth with bloody razor-sharp teeth. Panic truly set in. Then I heard the scream again. At the same time, it swiftly swung its dangly arm at me, which had pointy, sharp, long fingers attached at the end of it. Ducking out the way of its arm, it managed to tear a chunk of flesh from my right shoulder. Blinding with pain, I tripped and fell down an embankment, rolling down, and I missed a few trees but smashed into one of them. Winded, I feebly tried getting up, but to no avail. This was useless. My ankle was severely sprained, and I had no strength to get myself up off the ground. In a desperate attempt, I dragged myself into a bush so it couldn't see me. It was pitch black at this point. Rummaging around in my backpack like a madman, I clung onto my knife. Laying there in agonizing pain and wheezing, I could hear it grunting, walking around looking for me. I was shaking uncontrollably. I thought I was going to die. After laying in the bush for what felt like hours, listening to it patrol the area around me and grunting, I had a moment of stupidity. Looking out of the bush, I no longer saw the 7-foot figure. I saw the silhouette of a deer feet away from me. With every ounce of courage and energy I had, I leapt out of the bush, throwing my body and my knife at the deer. Driving my knife into its skull, I could hear the crunching of the bone and the squelching of flesh, and a viscous liquid cover my hand. At the same time, an inhuman scream, similar to the screams before that, came from the deer. The deer fell limp, and so did my body next to it. Hoping I killed it, and it's not going to kill me, I passed out from exhaustion. Waking up hours later with the sun beaming down on my face with its warm rays, I realized I was still alive. However, the deer must be as well. Getting up and looking around, there was no sight of the deer nor my knife, just a blood trail going back to where I was running from. Then I heard the same scream again from the same direction. Panic rushing my body again, I sprinted down the trail, still hearing the same scream over and over, getting closer and getting back to my car, throwing myself into it, and sped to the closest hospital. That's the day I truly believe skinwalkers are real, and I managed to survive. Somehow. Fourth story. I think my friend is a skinwalker. I've been lurking around on the forums for a while now, and I was about to give up until I found this thread. I've read some similar experiences to my own, so I figured you all would be able to bring more clarity to all of this. This all happened back during this past summer in the state of Kentucky. To protect his identity, and out of respect for his family, I will refer to my friend as James. I was spending time together with James, celebrating his completion of finals and my recent promotion, drinking to our heart's content, and we had the thirst of a Norse warrior at a midsummer festival. Starting with a nice bottle of Japanese whiskey that lasted all but 30 minutes, we moved on to something a little classier, Jim Beam. We sipped until day became night, and everything got fuzzy around the edges. James took a long pull off the bottle before he turned to me and asked if I want to go for a night walk to our favorite stargazing spot. I obliged by taking the final swig. This was just one of the things James and I would do every weekend, and surprisingly our parents were okay with it. Ever since we had science class together as kids, we loved stars and outer space, and the clearing was like our own private research facility. We had a large amount of forested area near where we lived, and the clearing was just 1.5 miles into the woods. I would pack my budget telescope, and we would get nice views of the moon in its differing phases, as well as nearby planets and visible galaxies. After high school, James had saved up a couple $1,000s to spend on one of those fancy scopes that could be remote controlled and could take HD videos. We would often talk about black holes, the inevitable heat death of the universe, or if there were other Earth-like planets out there with life like ours. We could even recite all the differing spectral types of stars from memory. It was the foundation of our friendship, though James was much more serious and even talked about going to college for a degree in astronomy once he had finished his general education courses at the local community college. He was the only kid from class that said he wanted to be an astronaut and was serious about it. I was content looking at the stars through my telescope from my backyard, beer in hand, and not being in debt. It was a bad idea, but we did not care, and off into the night we went. Along the way, there was this drainage ditch we would pass by. Alluring today, as it was back then, for no good reason other than it was creepy. Being as inebriated as we were, we took the bait and headed down. Being extra careful to scale down the steep incline of the ditch walls, we made it inside. It was your standard drainage ditch, a large concrete canal stretching out about 10 miles in both directions, dividing the forested land in two. There was an overpass that ran across a small portion of the ditch like a bridge, connecting the two pieces of land so that people could walk across. Along the graffiti-riddled walls of the canals were drainage holes to help disperse the water should the levels rise high enough. One of these was a drainage tube about 2 m wide and 50 m long, what we dubbed the butthole. The other end of the butthole led into the forest on the other side. As kids, we would crawl through it and act like it was a portal to another dimension or it would take us back in time. James could not resist. "Dude, look, the butthole. I'm going in, man," he exclaimed. "I can't believe you actually said that out loud. Be careful, you're going to scrape your knees or bonk your head," I warned. Once he got further in, he stopped moving. "Any xenomorphs in there?" I asked. "Nah. You hear this, frogman?" Indeed, I could hear the thing from where I was standing. As I approached, I noticed the croaks sounded guttural, throaty, and wet. If you've ever seen The Grudge, it sounded like the noise the girl makes, but not as drawn out. At that moment, I just chalked it up to my imagination, alcohol intoxication, or a big frog, though my anxiety was already setting in. But what was strange was that there was a little water still running through the ditch from last week's rain, and typically where there's water, there are frogs, though the croaks were coming from one source. Come to think of it, I do not recall any other noises, no bugs, no animals, no typical forest sounds. Dead silence, except for the frog. "What's wrong with Kermit?" he said. "I don't know, man, just come out. I'm starting to lose my buzz." With that, he scooted out backwards. Still a bit tipsy, he fell on his way out, then stood up to face me. "I just got pooped out." We climbed out of the drainage ditch and continued along the dirt path. I could still hear the croaking, but it was faint. The sounds of insects and small critters rustling in the foliage eventually returned and filled the unnerving silence, the croaking becoming a distant memory, and I settled down a bit. It was a clear night. The moon was clearly visible, and stars dotted the sky, like tinsel strewn about a black canvas. The trees reaching tall, towering above us, and a nice cool breeze blowing the refreshing smell of pine to our nostrils. It was a few minutes before we arrived at the clearing that James broke the silence. "Hey man, what's up? Look, I'm not sure how to even say this, but there's something I've been meaning to tell you for a while now. It's been weighing heavy on my heart, and I just need to get it off my chest. Of course, you know it's just you and I out here. I'm here for you, man. You can tell me anything." "Thanks," he sighed. "It's just, lately I've been thinking I might, whoa, dude, do you see that?" Wide-eyed, he pointed his finger ahead. I followed and saw what he was seeing. A young buck, 10-pointer, still with velvet around the antlers. "Wow, he's beautiful," I said. We had a staring contest for about 5 minutes. Everything seemed normal about the deer, but most of its body was cloaked by the shadows casted by the trees overhead. What I could see was its head and a portion of its neck. It could have been the glare from the moon overhead, but the eyes looked glossed over like thick cataracts or like it had been dead for a while. It was also trembling, which could have been because of us. The tips of the antlers I can remember clearly too, the way the moonlight gleamed off them, like the surface was glossy. I tried to take a step closer, and then suddenly the buck sprinted off into the woods. It looked like right before the buck ran off, the antlers twitched like fingers clenching to form a fist, but I brushed that off too, tried to stave my anxiety once more, and we started walking again. I really should have turned back at this point. After an additional 3 minutes, we had arrived at the clearing. James and I began walking to the middle. There we lied down on our backs, staring up at the sky. We were far enough from the city where light pollution wasn't visible. We could see a portion of the Milky Way galaxy, and the moon was in its waning gibbous phase. This almost would have been a perfect night for the telescope. In hindsight, I am glad we didn't bring it, because it was heavy and might have weighed me down. "Okay," I said, "you didn't finish what you were going to say back there. What's going on with you?" "Oh yeah, right, well I'm thinking about moving to—" Before he could even finish, he was interrupted by a scream. It sounded like a young girl, if I had to guess around the age of 10. "Help! Help me! Who's there?" "Yeah." I could not move my body. I couldn't even speak. I felt bad that I wasn't jumping into action, but for reasons I couldn't understand at the time, I was paralyzed. A primal fear had awoken in me, and I could only manage to turn my head slowly towards James. Our gaze locked. It felt like hours had passed. I broke out in a cold sweat and had trouble swallowing. My words kept catching in my throat, but eventually I managed to form words and spoke to James in a low whisper. "What should we do? Call the police. They'd never get here in time. And how do we explain where we are?" "Yes, officer. We're in some woods. There's dirt and rocks." "She sounds hurt. We might need to help her ourselves," he reasoned. James was the first to get up. Once he did, he extended his hand out to me and hoisted me up. The direction of the scream had come from our right, a little way past the tree line. We waited a while longer to see if the girl would call out again. "I think we should head over there, call out to her. She might be lost or hurt, man," James said. "I don't know. Something doesn't feel right. Don't you feel weird about this?" I questioned. "It's probably the booze, man. Regardless of how this feels, we need to go over there." We took a few careful steps towards the tree line. Before we got within 3 feet of the first tree, we heard a noise that has scarred me indefinitely for the rest of my life. For context, when I was younger, me and my friends would love to jump off the swing set at its peak because it gave us the sensation of flying. One time I managed to get some good height before I let go, but I botched the landing and all my weight landed on my right shoulder. It had become dislocated and I had to go to the hospital to have and popped back into its place. I'm not sure if you all ever had something like that happen to you, but the noise from the shoulder bone being reinserted back into the socket is disgusting. You'd never forget it. This noise was similar, but incredibly loud and wet. I could hear the bones shifting and adjusting even from this distance, muscles, tissues, and sinew being torn with the sound of wet fabric ripping. Then a rustling of leaves and brush, followed by silence. Once again frozen by fear, we could only wait for what would happen next. A voice called out to us, voices to be precise. The girl's voice, but 2 other voices spoke with it at the same time and with the same cadence. One being a significantly lower pitch, the other sounded like my own. "Stop! That hurts! Wow, he's beautiful!" Hearing my own words and voice was enough. I pissed out the liquor all over myself in that moment. I don't know much about trauma and how the human brain reacts, but what happened next comes back to me only in fragments. Thinking about it too hard always results in a panic attack. I remember multiple gaunt limbs, a misshapen head with horns, matted and patchy blonde hair, tall and lanky body with saga leathery skin, pustules all over. I remember it running towards us on all 4s, body turned sideways. Then came the gunshots running through the woods. I remember hearing a deer bleat mixed with the sound of a death rattle of a dying old man. And the rest is a blur, but I remember waking up in my own bed. I haven't seen James since that night. Anytime I would reach out to him, there's no reply, and his phone goes straight to voicemail. I want to know if that was real or if we were just drunk and imagining things. I'm thankful he was carrying his firearm that night because I'm not sure if we would have made it back, but I don't understand why he won't talk to me. I just feel crazy. What was that thing? Has anyone else encountered something similar in the area? I've heard of things called skinwalkers from the forums on here. Could that be what that was? It was capable of mimicry, albeit not particularly good. I received a text message from James today, and it was one of the reasons I decided to share. It simply read, "You left me. 5th story. Skinwalker encounter at my grandparents' cabin. My grandparents own a cabin in a small town in Pennsylvania, south of Scranton. My family typically visits every summer for a few weeks, a tradition we've followed since I was a child. A few years ago, however, we decided to go in the winter because my family wanted to ski. Strange occurrences started almost as soon as we arrived. The house, built in the 1920s, is made of old brick and wood, with large, almost church-like doors and a distinctly medieval style that adds to its eerie atmosphere. On our first night, nothing seemed overtly strange at first, though I've always had a sense that something was watching me whenever I stayed there. Around 3:10 a.m., I woke up to use the bathroom. Unusual for me, since I typically sleep through the night without interruption. There were 8 of us in the house: my parents, grandparents, aunt, uncle, and 2 male cousins. I headed to one of the 3 main bathrooms, 4 in total if you include the master, and was surprised to hear someone inside. I'm one of the few people who normally uses that particular bathroom alone, so I decided to wait rather than disturb them, especially since one of my cousins gets upset if you knock while he's in there. The movements I heard were disturbing. It sounded like someone was dragging their feet, which made me worry that my cousin might be sick. I called out, "Drew, are you okay? It's been a while, and I want to go back to bed." Moments later, Drew emerged from his bedroom instead, irritated by the noise I was making. He said he was trying to sleep and slammed his door shut. Before I could react, he was gone, and it suddenly registered that the bathroom door hadn't even been locked. At that point, the sounds had stopped, and it didn't seem like anyone was in there anymore. I'm not prone to sleepwalking or other sleep disorders, so I try to reassure myself it was just my imagination. Even so, I cautiously opened the bathroom door. Nothing looked amiss, until I noticed that the window was open. We were on the 2nd floor, making it highly unlikely anyone could have climbed up there, which made the situation even more unsettling. The next day passed without incident, which made the previous night's events feel like a product of my imagination. But that evening, I had to let out my dog, an elderly animal who rarely barks or moves quickly. To my surprise, she bolted toward the edge of the woods and disappeared among the trees. I followed her barking, but was too frightened to go beyond the tree line. When she finally returned, she seemed wrong. Her back legs moved as though she were a person pretending to be a dog, and her eyes looked unnervingly human instead of their usual dark, almond shape. Terrified, I ran back inside without her. However, once I was indoors, I found her already there, panting by the door, which meant she must have slipped in while I was searching for her in the woods. By this point, I was thoroughly alarmed about what might be lurking outside. I had never heard of skinwalkers or anything similar, so I had no frame of reference for what was happening. The final night brought the most unsettling event. We had gone skiing during the day and turned in early, around 9 or 10 p.m. Though I'm usually a night owl, I woke around midnight to hear my cousin Drew yelling outside. In a fog, I rushed to open the door, without realizing it was still locked from the inside. Stepping outside, I could hear Drew's voice echoing from multiple directions at once. I spotted him near the cars, shouting. When I called to him, he looked at me with wide eyes, then darted into the woods, beckoning me to follow. It felt like a terrible idea, so I woke his parents instead. It turned out Drew was asleep in his room the entire time. Years later, I learned about skinwalkers from a Native American friend I met in college. I still don't know what was out there during that winter weekend, and I haven't returned to the cabin since. 6th story. There's a skinwalker lurking in the Jemez Mountains of New Mexico. I am a former resident of Albuquerque, New Mexico. I love it here. We have jaw-dropping sunsets along with our world-famous question, red or green. But there was one specific occurrence that makes me sick to my stomach that happened to have taken place only 2 hours from my humble city. It was early 2015. My father, my sister, and I all decided to go camping in the Jemez Mountains one last time before school started. We own a camper, and we use it every time we go camping. So we hit the road in the early afternoon, and we arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. We have a great spot that is about a quarter mile off from the campgrounds. There's at least 1 or 2 people camping within a mile radius from our spot, so it's always nice and quiet. For some context, our spot is cornered by 2 semi-hills, and then there's a trail that leads to the main road. Father has told me that cattle and wildlife pass along that dense trail at night. Just another pro to camping in the Jemez. The sun started to set, so we made a campfire just behind the trail. After about 4 s'mores, me and my sister decide to hit the hay. My dad, being a firefighter, knows that you should never leave a campfire unattended, so he decides to stay out just a little bit longer before putting it out. It's around 9 p.m., and I'm falling asleep, until suddenly I heard my father scream from outside. I was then relieved when he chuckled and started to curse. He then came inside and told us what all the commotion was about. He said while he was watching the fire, he felt breathing on his neck. He almost pissed himself, he said. He thought there was a bear behind him. He then slowly looked behind him only to see a moose. He cursed and laughed because a damn moose made him scream. We all started laughing and pushed the event aside. I woke up about an hour later to the bright glow of flames. Oh shit, Father didn't put out the fire, I thought to myself. I opened the blinds only to see two bright as hell eyes peering from the trail. They looked like a dog's eyes when you shine a flashlight on them, but only 10x brighter. I let out a curse and fell back to sleep. It was too late for that shit. I woke up the next day to the smell of bacon and eggs. I was still wondering about what my father said the night before. Something just seemed really off about it. Then I realized what was so off about what my father said. It hit me like a brick. I spoke with a stuttered dad. Moose don't live in New Mexico. He looked at me with a confused look, and then his face went stone cold. Tell your sister we're leaving in an hour. Pack all of your stuff up. We left about 45 minutes later. I knew my dad is a skeptic. He believes in the everything is connected kind of spirituality. Whenever we talk about ghosts or scary stories, he always says something along the lines of someone could have easily made that up. But the way he reacted to his realization of seeing a moose in New Mexico validated that he wasn't looking for a logical explanation. He wanted to get the hell out of there to protect us. I couldn't relate this experience to other scary stories until I heard of the so-called skinwalkers. I can confirm that what my dad saw that night was a skinwalker. It checked out in every category of what they look like and how they behave. The eyes of a skinwalker are brighter than LED lights. They can take the form of coyote, deer, sheep, human, you name it. Now, of course, the logical explanation was that he saw an elk, not a moose. But when I pushed my dad to tell about what he saw, he swears to God that he saw a moose, because moose have elongated snouts that most elks lack. I needed to get this weight off of my chest. So, if anybody can relate or develop a logical explanation for what me and my father saw, I'm open to what you guys have to offer. And yes, we have gone back almost 7 times for the past 2 years, and we never saw it again. 7th story. My skinwalker story. Arizona. Okay, so to start out, I live in Mesa, Arizona, which is basically Phoenix, Arizona, because the main cities of Arizona spread out into many sites with no border in between. Mesa is what I would call the suburbs of Phoenix. I changed my name, of course. I live in an apartment complex I would describe as close to the ghetto, but still nice. I live in a bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment inn with my girlfriend. Arizona is a state full of ancient Native American history. I live next to a Hohokam Canal, as do many Arizonians. The whole place used to be cities of ancient Native Americans. The point is I'm in the area for what I believe to be a skinwalker. I'll get to my story. Yesterday, I was drinking, one of the things I picked up during the COVID-19 quarantine, or what's enforced here. And I decided to smoke a bowl on my apartment patio, which I don't usually do, mind you. I just finished loading up my pipe and taking the first hit when I hear a voice somewhere nearby. Amanda, open the door, please. It was a young, probably in the 20s girl's voice talking, and it sounded calm and teasing. It continued on as I tried to ignore it smoking my last bud. After about 4 times of it repeating itself, my curiosity caused me to look for the source. I saw in an apartment building facing across from me movement. I saw a dog standing on its hind legs, leaning on a door, tapping. At first I shrugged, of course. Then I hear the voice again. It sounded exactly the same as last time. Exactly the same, as if you record their voice in that sentence and replayed it once again. There wasn't any other sound or movement in the complex. I watched the thing knock on Amanda's door for like 30 seconds in what I would call a state of shock and curiosity. Then it stopped and didn't move for another 20 seconds, until the dog thing stood all the way up away from the doorway on its hind legs and turned to face me. It made eye contact with me, which is weird because we were at least 50 yards away. I'm on the 3rd floor, it's on the 2nd, but I felt it looking at me. I held its eye contact. I was so scared, I felt like I should run. Then it got on all fours and headed down the stairs slowly. At the bottom, it started slowly walking over to me. I was on all fours now, about to go inside or scream, I don't know. But I had to know what this thing was going to do. It walked close to my balcony. Yes, it was a dog, a brownish yellow, dirty-looking thing with big eyes that were 100% attentive to mine. It didn't seem natural, to be honest, but nothing looked wrong at a glance, except that it was staring into my eyes and wouldn't stop. I ran inside as it reached the bottom of my stairs and locked my doors. Soon I heard clawing at my door, doggy clawing. Next I heard the door handle jiggle, then it started on my porch door. I, of course, never answered. Instead, I hid behind my kitchen counter with a knife. After about 30 minutes it left. I stayed up all night, but I didn't see it again, and I didn't go out again. I'm hoping it doesn't come back. I haven't gone outside at night again. I'm burning sage and trying to be careful as I can. 8th story. Skinwalkers of the UK. Background. I am a 23-year-old, 5'9" male from Manchester in the UK. I just recently moved from the south of Manchester to a town in the north. For anonymity's sake, I'm changing names for the tale of our encounter. I'll call myself Ben, my brother Joe, and my friend Alex. The house I live in now is an old Victorian-style terraced house with a small back garden and a large open field behind that leading off into a big nature reserve. So this happened yesterday, and I'm still coming to terms with it, though we're entirely sure what we saw. I need to put this out there. My friend and I moved in together in this new house with a field on the back, and for night one we heard noises coming from the back gardens, sensor lights lighting up for neighbors' gardens, fences rattling, bins knocking over. We chalked it up as being foxes looking for an easy meal or cats on a late-night hunt, since it was a huge wooded area leading into back gardens where people keep their bins, so we thought nothing of it. My bedroom overlooks the back garden, and I can see over the field and onto the tree line for the forest. One night the other week was a pretty hot night, so I left my bedroom windows open to let some breeze in and cool me down. The sun went down, and I heard the usual cat activity. Fighting, hissing, and fences rattling when they jump up to go where they want to go. About 3 hours into a YouTube marathon, I noticed it was dead silent outside. Not your usual quiet, I mean dead silent, as though I didn't have my windows open at all. That was until dogs started barking. The creeped out feeling caused by the lack of noise went away, and I went back to YouTube. Another 30 minutes passed when the barking was joined by more dogs in that time, and honestly it was starting to piss me off, so I went to the window to shut it as to block out the noise. What I saw still scares as I'm writing this, because now I know what it was. At the edge of the field, far and off to the left of the tree line, looked to be a silhouette of a dog. What caught my eye is how big it was. It must have been 5 feet tall, and considering I'm 5'9", I was understandably intrigued. At first it didn't move, but as I watched, a light came on in the garden adjacent to it, and it stood up on its back legs. Awestruck, this thing now stood at about 9 feet tall. I still couldn't see it properly due to the distance we were apart, but this thing shot off into the wood like a rocket, way too fast for anything of that size to move. I stayed at the window, dogs still barking, driving me nuts until I decided I was being stupid. I couldn't see it properly, and I was tired and my eyes were strained for watching videos, so I just shrugged it off as myself being tired and my eyes playing tricks on me. I went to bed that night after watching more videos to lull me to sleep. Now, it wouldn't be a scary encounter if it ended there, and unfortunately for us, it didn't. I, for one, wish it had. Fast forward 2 weeks, and my brother Joe came up from my parents' house for the weekend. He's 15, and we both love the outdoors. Camping, survival craft, made-up apocalypse stories and scenarios are our forte. We spent the night inside as it was raining, and it got too dark and late to venture out at that time. We got a pizza and played some Xbox and went to sleep. Yesterday we got up and got our shit together for the trip, said bye to my friend Alex, and set out on the road to the entrance of the forest. It didn't take us long to find a decent spot to set up, only about 2 hours walk. Joe gathered firewood while I set up the tents and got food ready. Everything was going well, and we were having fun seeing who could flick pebbles the furthest. It's about 9 p.m., and we both decide it's time to get some sleep, so we zip up the tents and fall asleep. Later in the night, I'm woken up by Joe unzipping my tent quietly and stepping inside, trying to be quiet. He kept his gaze outside and looked spooked. I sat up and asked, "What's wrong?" Lifting a finger to his mouth and crouching down, he whispered, "There's someone out there." Only now did I notice he had his knife in his hand. I asked what happened, and he only said, "Went for a pee and heard sticks snapping." Just then I heard what he meant. It sounded like it was coming from behind his tent. He was breathing heavy and was looking at me wide-eyed. I motioned for him to stay quiet, and I grabbed my knife too. We listened for what seemed like hours when we heard it move off into the woods in front of our sight. This brought a sense of ease until we heard a whispered voice call from outside the site. "Joe. Joe, look at this tree." It sounded like me. Exactly like me. We froze staring at each other, trying to make heads or tails of what we were hearing. I remembered I shouted that earlier that day because this tree I saw was wonky and weird looking, and I knew Joe would get a kick out of it. It started again, "Joe, this tree." It sounded angrier now. It went silent. We stayed there petrified until I mustered up enough courage to look between the gap in the zippers. At the edge of the site, lit dimly by our now dying fire, I saw a huge dog-like thing with thick fur, red human-shaped eyes, a short snout, and huge muscly legs, staring the way a stray dog looks at someone eating a chicken leg, hungrily in my brother's tent. I move away from the hole, reluctantly, not wanting to take my eye off this thing, but needing to know if it was just me seeing this thing too. I motioned for him to have a look with my hand on his shoulder, ready to pull him away if anything happens. He was shaking like a leaf at this point, and so was I, but I still needed to stay strong and keep him calm as a good older brother should. We hear quiet, then it walked around the site again, every so often stopping and repeating, "Joe, this tree, and look at this tree." We waited until we couldn't hear anything before we talked again. "What was that, Ben?" "I have no idea, but I think we should stay awake." We whispered to each other. It was daylight before we even looked outside again. It was long since gone. We cautiously stepped out, knives in hand, and me first. Staring at where the thing was stood, there were no tracks, no marks. Only a few broken sticks and twigs. We packed our bags one at a time, one on the lookout, and one packing and switching after he was finished packing. We got back to the trail and speed walked out of there, passing bikers and dog walkers. We didn't say a word until we got home and broke down in the living room telling Alex what had happened. She just sat there, coffee in hand, jaw swung low and gawpingly staring at us, spilling details of our run-in with this thing. When we were done, she looked us straight, glancing between us, and said one word: "Skinwalker." Needless to say, now I know I'll be staying in my parents' house for a while with my brothers and finding a new place to live in the city. 9th story. So you guys like Skinwalker stories? I have a quick one for you. I posted one another thread, but it was so long, I didn't want to hijack the comment section of a good story. I'm dying, Navajo, and boy have I heard a lot of stories growing up on the reservation. While I've never seen anything myself, which I'm grateful for, I have benefited by being around the people who have. There's a different kind of evil that exists in the quiet high deserts and deep sandstone canyons of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, even Colorado in the Southern Ute area. I can only describe it as an ancient evil. Now, there are helpful ceremonies, rituals, and traditions that are still practiced to this day. Hell, even a local hospital has an on-duty medicine man. But it seems to be a double-edged sword. What I mean is there's also black magic, which most dime will not even acknowledge or speak of. We are very superstitious and are heavy with taboos. You will find this with most First Nation people. From Alaska to Argentina, it's just something you don't do in fear that it will get the attention of unwanted spirits or harmful beings. Skinwalkers or Naldlushii are just a few stories that kept me up at night with the covers over my head. Here's a quick one for you guys. A Navajo tribal police officer was driving west on what used to be officially named Highway 666. It was lighty snowing, maybe a quarter-inch, which is a lot of snow for home, and he sees an old woman walking on the side of the road. How she got there or where she was going was not apparent because she was so far out in the middle of nowhere. He didn't see her right way, but as he passes, he noticed that she is dressed in traditional clothing, a shawl, dress, moccasins, and her hair in the traditional bun. Not too odd. Many elders still choose to dress traditionally. But why was she out in such cold weather this late at night? Hitchhiking. Maybe he passed her too quickly and now has to turn around. And as he makes a U-turn, he notices she is nowhere to be seen. This is fairly flat terrain, and he for sure seen an old woman walking. He pulls the squad car over and steps out with his flashlight. Confused, he manages to find the woman's footprints in the shallow snow. He follows the footprints until they suddenly turn into what look like dog footprints leading away from the road in a hurry. He immediately jumps back into the squad car and meets up with another officer near his patrol. He is a little shaken up, but asks the other officer if he has ever seen anything like that. The officer tells him that he has. He also explains that sometimes it's an old woman, sometimes a very beautiful young girl, but always on that road and always in the snow, waiting for the right Good Samaritan to let her into their car. I still get nervous driving those wide, open spaces at night. I keep my eyes strictly on the road and turn my music up high. I rarely pick up hitchhikers, but I never pick them up at night. 10th story. I think I met a skinwalker. Growing up in Arizona, I could say I was raised in a melting pot. Yeah, I know, pun intended. It's hot out here, but honestly, I met a lot of cool kids, including some of the Navajo children. They weren't any different than me. They just have separate cultural norms than my family. During class earlier this week, one of my friends joked around about something called a skinwalker. Immediately, the Navajo children shot a pissed and worrisome look to him. I decided to confront him. Hey dude, it looks like you really upset them. So what? It's not my fault they're afraid of skinwalkers, he yelped, putting special volume and enunciation on the last words. As silly as it is, I didn't even know what that was. So I asked him, and he responded, but I love to piss those kids off. Later in gym class, I walked to the bleachers from the track to the kids. Hey fellas, I'm sorry for my friend. He can be a real jerk sometimes. They told me not to worry about it. You know, guys, you don't have to, but can you guys tell me what skinwalker is? I've never even heard of it till this day. One of the kids started looking around cautiously, and I felt like he was about to tell me, but he hesitated as a grasshopper bounced off his foot. You know, I think you're better off not knowing, and even more better off not saying their name. Feeling defeated, I walked home to my family's ranch. I noticed as I was about on the porch, there was a couple coyotes nearby. They've always been a big problem in this area. They bother my family's livestock, and a donkey can only kill so many. Normally I could scare them off by tossing a rock or something, but when I did, they remained still. I walked inside and told my dad about the coyotes, and he loaded up his shotgun. Dad wasn't much a hunter, but he had no sympathy for invasive coyotes and rattlesnakes. He kept a single-shot 12-gauge by the door in the event one of the two made their way on the property. Dad walked out and peppered the ground near one. All of them scattered but one. He got into a stare down with my dad and wasn't bucking under the threat of being pumped full of shell. I saw Dad pop in another shell, and he fired again, striking the coyote and laying it down. He hollered at me that he was going to drag the body off the property and would be back shortly. That evening, he came in limping, not like in a pain limp, but in an awkward one that seemed unlike anything I'd seen before. Dad, what happened? Did you twist an ankle? No, son. Fell carrying carcass. Be okay. Great, he had been drinking again. I bet that's took him so long. Probably hit the bottle in the barn once he hauled the coyote away. Lord knows this wasn't the first time that's happened. I figured while he was drunk, I could ask him about skinwalkers. Dad was pretty superstitious, which makes sense why he wouldn't try to scare me with ghost stories. Dad, someone at school said something about skinwalkers, and I've never heard of such a thing. Do you know anything about that? He instantly sobered up. Well, listen here, boy. Skinwalkers are magnificent witches who can transform themselves into animals. Most of the kids at your school wouldn't dare speak of them because they fear them. But that's all fake, right? Dad chuckled. No, you never know when one is near. Could be any animal. Some of the ones could be insects, people. They are masters of disguise. He stood up and hobbled out the door. Don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong, and mind who your company is. He then walked back out the barn. Later that night, he walked in and took his boots off. Hey, Dad. I'm sorry for bringing up skinwalkers. I know you've worked hard all day and don't have time to answer questions. Son, what are you talking about? Did you fall asleep? I hauled the coyote off and loaded it on the trailer to take for a proper burial. I just pulled in. Thanks a lot for watching the video. Till the end, subscribe to Horror in Detail for more videos. Drop your suggestions in comment section.